Hello and welcome. This is an illustrated biography of John Wayne Gacy. My name is Tammy Stewart. I am a master's student of psychology at the University of Arizona Global Campus, and this is for my personality theory final in Professor Kelly Locke's class. As a society, there is an intense interest and fascination with criminals and serial killers. Society seems to obsess and fantasize over some of the most infamous serial killers in history. This fascination is evidenced by the hundreds and thousands of true crime television shows, movies, books, and podcasts that we flood society with. A big part of the fascination is an inability to comprehend how somebody can commit such gross atrocities to another human as to capture them, harm them, murder them even. Psychology aims to understand the mind and to give comprehension as to why the brain goes awry. We see this evidence by studies done into bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety disorders, and many other psychological disorders that members of society are faced with at a seemingly alarming rate. And even more so, psychology is working to understand what happens inside of the mind of serial killers that allows them to take the life of another. John Wayne Gacy is one such mind that society and psychologists alike have tried to understand. Upon farther examination, it could be supposed that the way in which John Wayne Gacy functioned and how he became one of the most infamous serial killers of society is directly related to how he adjusted to the world, his cognitive functions, the culture that he was raised in, and biological factors that contributed to his temperament. John Wayne Gacy was born March 17, 1942, to John Stanley Gacy, a World War I veteran and auto mechanic, and to Marion Gacy, a homemaker. The Gacys were a middle-class family of Danish and Polish heritage who raised their children in the Roman Catholic faith. The elder John Gacy was reportedly an alcoholic that was abusive physically, emotionally, and verbally, taking special interest in focusing that abuse on his son. It was reported that the senior Gacy man would belittle his son, calling him homophobic slurs. This abuse left a visible impact on Gacy's life. At the age of 11, John Wayne Gacy suffered a head injury when he was hit on the head with a swing. This injury would cause John to have periods of blackout throughout his adolescent years. It wouldn't be until John reached the age of 16 that a doctor would discover a blood clot on his brain, which would require surgery. When Gacy was 22, he married and moved to Iowa to become the general manager of his in-laws' chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. John would use this position to entice young men and boys to perform sexual acts with him. These sexual acts would lead to his arrest and conviction in 1968 for sodomy. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his crimes. During his prison stint, Gacy's wife divorced him. After prison, Gacy moved to the outskirts of Chicago, where he became a model member of society. He became active in the local chapter of the JCs, and he joined his local Democratic Party, even being a part of the Democratic Convention, which brought First Lady Rosalind Carter as a speaker. He even volunteered at community events and fundraisers as a clown to entertain children. Gacy's non-threatening demeanor and seeming appearance of normalcy would disarm his targets and give him ample opportunity to pick up his habits from Iowa. Eventually, these habits would lead to the sodomy and murder of at least 33 young men and boys. After he was convicted for the murder and sodomy of these young boys and men, Gacy's life would end in 1994 by lethal injection as a result of that conviction. Adjustment can be defined as the ability to not just blend into the world, but also control emotions and have an accurate sense of oneself. Despite appearing to be a model member of society, John Wayne Gacy cannot be considered a well-adjusted member of society. We see this evidenced by his inability to project his true self to society, by his needing to keep his bisexual tendencies separate from the rest of society, and his tendency to present a face of philanthropy to society while being a face of con artistry to young men and boys that he could get alone. To understand perhaps why John Wayne Gacy would not be well adjusted to society, we look to psychology to find more clarification. Erik Erikson's psychological theory gives an understanding of how John Wayne Gacy grew up to be maladjusted with society. In each stage of development, it is easy to see how John Wayne Gacy may not have reached the resolution that Erikson said was necessary to adjust well with the world. At any or all stages of psychological development, John Wayne Gacy perhaps could not have reached reconciliation. This would have led to lifelong struggles to adjust for Gacy. Examples of these inappropriate reconciliations that Gacy could have faced would have been from the conflict at birth, not being able to form the bond of trust in his paternal figure, to the conflict of toddler years, where he was made to feel shame with the emotional abuse that his father put him through. And in his preschool years, he would have had guilt over initiative through that same physical, verbal, and emotional abuse that his father put him through. His father's abuse remaining a theme throughout his childhood, when it may have led him to feel inferior in his grade school years, and which would have made him unable to reconcile that industry versus inferior conflict in a positive manner. The self-professed bisexual John Wayne Gacy would have had an inability to reconcile the conflict of identity versus role confusion in his teenage years, especially as he dealt with non-heterosexual feelings in a world where homosexuality was still considered to be a mental illness, in a world where his father belittled him and called him homophobic slurs, and in a world where there was such an impact of gender norms. John Wayne Gacy was still a young adult when he first was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to prison. It could have been during this time that John Wayne Gacy felt isolation that could not be reconciled with the desire for intimacy, that the young adult years strive to resolve that conflict. Gacy would not have reached middle age or older adult years before he began to sodomize and murder young men and boys. Therefore, consideration for how those conflicts were reconciled doesn't really need to be considered when trying to reach a point of understanding to John Wayne Gacy's psyche. Another important area in which to consider when attempting to understand how John Wayne Gacy could take 33 other human lives is how his cognitive functions affected him. Cognition is an important factor that goes into understanding a person's psychological health. If a person is psychologically healthy, then they will have an accurate view of the world. On the other hand, if psychologically they are unhealthy, their view of the world will be skewed. An unhealthy psyche could explain a skewed vision that allows one to justify harming others. There are a few psychological theories that would give understanding to John Wayne Gacy's cognition. Freud, who began his career as a neurologist, recognized that brain injuries frequently cause strange reactions in the body and mind. Freud's understanding of the mind potentially could explain how John Wayne Gacy's mind allowed him to reconcile the sodomizing and murder of so many young men and boys. The brain injury that Gacy received in his childhood could have left some long-standing reverberations that affected him throughout his life. More recent studies into the effect of brain trauma indicate there is long-lasting trauma that does not reconcile just because the wounds have healed. Nearly 1/3 of brain injury survivors will have faced some type of mental health disorder, such as depression, anxiety, and major depressive disorder. If Gacy's injury caused any of these long-standing mental health disorders, there is a possibility that he suffered from one that would have affected his ability to think straight and to control anger and reconcile conflicts of development. In addition to causing mental health disorders, more recent research has determined that traumatic brain injuries can cause aggression, impulsivity, and antisocial behavior, which are all markers of serial killers. A development of aggression, impulsivity, and antisocial behavior could also help the psychology community to understand John Wayne Gacy's motivations and behaviors that led to his infamy. John Wayne Gacy was raised in a culture that revolved around the importance of the Roman Catholic religion. In Gacy's time, psychologists would have felt that there was not much impact on John's religious beliefs in comparison to his psyche. However, as the science of psychology advances and we learn more about the human brain, the importance of religious beliefs and how they affect the psyche has become more well known and widely accepted. The impact of his upbringing would have not only affected his psyche, but it would have also made John want to embrace his philanthropic side, which would have also put others at ease with John Wayne Gacy, opening up more opportunities for him to commit his crimes. John Wayne Gacy's culture went beyond his religious upbringing. He was raised by middle-class parents in the center of the country at the height of the American dream. His father would have been considered a hero as a blue-collar auto mechanic who was a World War I veteran. His mother would have been considered well-respected and honored as she stayed at home with her children, being there in a supportive role for them in all aspects of their life. In John Wayne Gacy's culture, gender roles were very important, so much so that everything John did would be considered weak or effeminate. Everything John did that would be considered weak or effeminate, the senior John Gacy would belittle his son and call him homophobic slurs for. John's father expected him to be a strong man, even from birth. In fact, his father was incensed when his son defecated in the womb. He saw this as a sign of weakness. And it seemed that this singular act that was out of John Wayne Gacy's control seemed to be a catalyst that made his father strike out at him more than he did any of his other children, which would have impacted him throughout his life. After his childhood, Gacy married his first wife at the age of 22 when he met her working in a department store. This marriage led to a change of scenery that would have Gacy leave the state of Illinois for the very first time to work at his in-laws' chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. This gave Gacy a new culture to live in. The Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants provided Gacy with a position of power that perhaps he had never felt before. This sudden rush of power would have given Gacy a sense of a whole new culture in itself. William Pitt once said something to the effect of, "Power corrupts the man who has it." Perhaps the sudden rush of power that John Wayne Gacy experienced corrupted him, as Mr. Pitt had suggested. Whatever the reason, Gacy's new ranking was something that he had never experienced before. It was the direct opposite of what he had experienced back home in his father's house, when his father made him to feel weak and worthless. For the first time, Gacy had authority over something. Gacy would use that authority to form, quote, clubs and invite some of the younger men and teenage boys that worked for his KFC stores into his house. He would use this position to seduce the boys and young men. It was these experiences that would lead to his eventual conviction and sentencing to 10 years in prison for sodomy. Gacy's prison sentence would have given him an entirely new culture to experience. And during this stint in prison, Gacy would lie to other inmates, presumably to protect his masculinity, so that he would not have to be perceived as homosexual by the other men. Originally, psychology said that culture did not have much impact on a subject's personality. However, more recently, psychologists have discovered that culture affects how personality is developed. Where some cultures put an emphasis on the importance of individuality, other cultures put a sense of importance on the importance of working together. We see this when we look at Eastern and Western cultures. Eastern cultures that put an emphasis on the importance of working together, they're going to join together to complete a task easier. Whereas Western cultures that put an emphasis on individuality, they're going to work harder to stand out in the crowd. Alfred Adler posed that there is a far greater importance on culture than the psychologists who preceded him originally believed. Adler believed that social roles, including that of gender roles and other aspects of cultural importance, would be impactful in formulating the personality of a subject. Adler felt that specifically where gender roles were concerned, there were adverse effects on both sexes. Thus, Adler most likely would have found that the culture that John Wayne Gacy's father raised him in would have been detrimental to his personality. In addition to the belief that Adler held that gender roles were detrimental to psychological health, Adler would suggest that the change in social roles that John Wayne Gacy faced when he became general manager of the Kentucky Fried Chicken would have also impacted his psychological growth. A question that is asked by psychologists is, how big of a role does biology play on psychology? How big of a role does it play in the development and the developing of a personality and the health of the psyche? This is the question that fuels one side of the nature versus nurture debate. How much does biology affect mental health? Is there significant evidence that that temperament is strongly influenced by inherited traits from parents? More recently, there has been research in the fields of neurology and biology that has found there are genetic markers that contribute to the temperament of a subject. Erik Erikson's theory takes the stance that biology is what provides motivation for the reconciliation of conflicts throughout developmental stages. John Wayne Gacy's father could be examined to see that perhaps there was already a genetic predisposition for hurting others, as evidenced by the abuse he showered on his family. Not only does John Stanley Gacy's affinity for violence show that genetically John Wayne Gacy was capable of violence, but it also shows that the Gacy men had a predisposition for anger. This is evidenced by the younger Gacy man when he first committed murder. It was when one young man he had attempted to sodomize refused and fought back, thus angering John Wayne Gacy. Psychological development directly impacts how we adjust to society. We can see how, in the case of John Wayne Gacy, his inability to adjust was a direct result of his biology, cognitive ability, and culture, and his biology as they all intertwine together. His brain injury and biology affecting his ability to reason and calm down, while his religious culture would have impacted his ability to blend in with society and put others at ease. As psychology advances farther, we will continue to learn more about why the brain does the things that it does and how one person can reason things one way and another person can reason in a completely different manner. Thank you.